Hey, I'm Nicole. My goal in this video is to explain compression to the best of my ability. Hopefully by the end, you'll know exactly what a compressor is and how to use one. At the very least, you'll understand more than you did before you watched, and can come back to the video later on after playing around a little and fully understand everything the second time you watch. So, what is compression? The first mistake people make is assuming that compression in the context of mixing and music production is the same as file compression that you might use in MP3s, for example. These are totally different things. Compression, when said in the context of music production, is simply the reduction in volume of a signal. And that's essentially all compressors in a DAW like Ableton or FL are doing. They're just doing it in a special way that can add or remove dynamics in different ways. Now we've got that out of the way, I'll explain it in a bit more depth. There are 4 key elements to a compressor, and each play their part in the final sound. So what are they really? I'll explain them in simple terms now and try to explain them in more detail later. This is the easiest way to think of ratio. It's simply the amount of compression you're applying. Higher values equal more compression. Lower values equal less compression. And you can think of threshold as defining the point at which that compression starts happening. Higher threshold values mean that the signal needs to be much louder for it to start being compressed, as opposed to a lower threshold value, which will make even the quietest parts of a signal compressed. Now, attack is how fast the compression starts to happen once it's past the threshold. Smaller values will result in the compression happening almost instantly after it gets louder than the threshold value. And conversely, say for instance your attack value is a whole second long, it will result in the signal being let past the threshold for a full second before it starts being compressed. You can think of release as the smoothness in the change in volume that the compressor is causing. Larger values will cause the signal to take longer to return to its original loudness after the compression has started, and can cause the signal to sound smooth. So smooth, in fact, it can give a swelling or sidechaining effect. This is easier to hear in drum loops and longer samples. Whereas extremely short release times can almost sound growly, rough, and aggressive as the level of the signal quickly jumps back to its original loudness after being compressed. If this still sounds confusing, that's okay, you're not alone. It can take a lot of experimenting and practice to fully understand compression. I'm going to try my best to streamline that process in the rest of this video with some practical examples. My first piece of advice is to get your signals sounding good before you compress, otherwise you might accentuate elements of the sound you don't like. You can always EQ after compression if you want to as well. So we've got this snare, it's completely dry apart from some EQ. Ableton's stock compressor has 3 different views, each of them presenting you with the information in a different way. Let's start with the third view, which is called activity view. In my opinion, this view is the easiest to visualize what's happening, especially for someone trying to understand compression for the first time. Let's ignore the ratio control for now, since it's the easiest of the 4 controls to understand. Remember, it's just the amount of compression, and it's set to a good value by default for this demonstration anyway. As I play the sample, you can see activity view is rendering a representation of the signal's volume level. Right now, our compressor is essentially doing nothing. This is because our threshold is set too high and our signal is entirely below it. So let's bring the threshold down to meet it. As I do that, notice how the blue line also moves down. This is activity view's representation of our threshold value. The yellow line is also interesting. This is the representation of the amount of volume we're reducing or compressing from the signal. Notice that the lower the threshold goes, the more the yellow line starts moving. This is because we're telling the compressor to reduce more and more of the signal in volume as we drag down the threshold. Also, remember the ratio control? Watch what happens to the yellow line when I adjust that. Hopefully you're starting to see how all these things are intimately linked. Attack and release is where it starts to get a little bit more nuanced, but still extremely important to dialing in the sound you're after. To make a baking analogy, think of threshold and ratio as setting the heat and cooking time on the oven, and think of attack and release as the cake itself. It doesn't matter if you have the right heat and cooking time. If you screw up the ingredients in the cake itself, it's going to taste like crap. So let's cover attack first. Attack is where you decide how hard or soft you want the sound to be. It's extremely useful for transient shaping and either increasing punch in your drums or also softening them out. Let's try dial in a punchy sound for the snare by increasing the attack a little bit so that we're letting the full signal through for a split second after it exceeds the threshold. This will emphasize the initial attack of the snare. Still struggling to hear it? Don't worry, there's a good reason for that. Remember how a compressor's job is to reduce a signal's volume in a pleasing way? Well, quieter signals sound objectively less pleasing to the human ear. So to hear the difference properly, we need to add the volume we took away back into the signal. In activity view, we can see how much volume we're reducing by looking down to the bottom right corner. We're taking away about 5.7 dB. So let's increase the output volume by roughly the same amount for a start. We can do that in the top right. This is called our makeup gain. Ableton's stock compressor can do this automatically. However, I prefer to volume match manually by bypassing the compressor and trying to match the volume only using my ears, because this way I can dial it in to match what my ears are telling me perfectly. Most of the time, volume matching just by getting the numbers exactly the same doesn't work perfectly. Because of how our ears perceive loudness in different frequency ranges, 10 dB of real-world loudness at 2000 Hz is going to sound a lot louder to your ears than 10 dB at 300 Hz, for example, because our ears are just a lot more sensitive to 2000 Hz. So if your compression happens to be accentuating or dulling those frequencies, the dB reading on the screen isn't going to take into account how your ears react to those frequencies. Now that the output is set to a good level, we can fairly compare what our compressed signal sounds like against the uncompressed signal. In my opinion, the compressed signal just has that extra punch that can be satisfying and really cut through a mix much better than the uncompressed signal. If you're still struggling to hear what the attack is doing, here's a trick. Bring the threshold all the way down. Now you're going to basically only hear what our attack setting is letting through. Hear that nice transient? That's what we're accentuating with the attack knob. Now let's bring it up to a realistic value. Most sounds have a sweet spot with the attack depending on what you're trying to do. Have the attack too fast and you'll essentially just be dulling the transients. Have it too slow and the compressor will hardly be doing anything. Now let's play around with the release. Notice how low values really make the sound growly and aggressive. If we make it a bit longer, for instance the exact length of the snare sample itself, it's going to sound a lot smoother and almost tighter sounding. If we make the release longer still, it's going to be interfering with the next snare hit, which is generally what we don't want. This will make your signal mushy and generally unmusical. Now that we've got our attack and release set to where we want them, we can further tune our ratio and threshold to get them just right. Now, if you're still with me, congratulations, you know how a compressor works. Let's quickly go over some of the other views and settings in Ableton's stock compressor, starting with the rest of activity view. These two settings, GR and output, just change the view style. GR shows the amount of gain reduction, displayed as the yellow line, and output simply shows both the input and the output signal simultaneously in grey, the solid outline grey being the output and the fainter grey being the input. Now we have peak, RMS and expand. I usually keep this on RMS for most sounds. Basically, RMS gives a smoother compression and takes into account average volume level over a short period of time, compared to peak, which compresses based on the true volume level at any given point. This means that RMS is going to give you a much smoother compression compared to peak mode, which will take into account the most extreme outlying volume differences. Expand turns the compressor into an expander, which means now everything that is above the threshold gets turned up in volume instead of down. This isn't used anywhere near as much as normal compression, so don't worry about it too much if you don't want to. Just know that it exists. Then we have knee. This is easier to visualize in the second view, which is called transfer curve view. Knee just defines a transition point between the uncompressed and compressed signal. A larger knee will result in a slow increase in ratio around the threshold point. A short or non-existent knee will result in an instant change in ratio around the threshold point. Generally, a longer knee equals a smoother sound more akin to analog compressors, and a small knee equals a more digital sound. The actual effect on your signal is quite subtle when set to modest values though, so don't get too hung up on it. Look defines the amount of look ahead you allow the compressor to have. Look ahead is great for getting accurate compression. However, this adds latency or lag, so is not ideal in a scenario when you're live tracking instruments, as there will be a noticeable lag between the musician playing a note and hearing it in the monitors. 0 ms usually sounds fine to me, so I keep it there. Although if you're in a pure mixing environment, or if for example you're mastering a song, you can set it to 10 ms to ensure transients aren't being messed with. We also have the envelope setting. Basically, when set to log or logarithmic, the compressor is going to apply slightly faster release times on outlying loud peaks compared to the quieter sections of the signal. And lin, or linear, is going to apply the same release on all parts of the signal. I usually keep it on log, but also sometimes experiment to see which setting I like on each given sound. Just keep in mind this will change the amount you're compressing the signal, so you'll need to volume match again to compare fairly. We also have this auto release setting. This automatically adjusts the release based on the incoming signal. I very rarely use this. You can get a much better and dialed in sound by adjusting the release manually, in my opinion, but it could give you an okay sound when compressing a drum loop or something like that. I would steer away from it when compressing single drum parts or one-shot sounds. Now let's explain the transfer curve view in a bit more detail. This is the more traditional style of compressor interface. Here you can see the ratio visualized by this blue line. It's also easier to explain what the numbers under the ratio knob actually mean in this view as well. Right now it's set to 3.71/1. All this means is that for every single dB of volume we put into the compressor, represented by the 1, we're reducing it by 3.7 dB, represented by the 3.7. Of course, the true amount of compression also depends on your threshold value, and that is represented by the big yellow dot, and your input signal is represented by the smaller yellow dot. Watch what happens to the blue line when I change the ratio value. The knee is also more easily visualized in this view because we can see the actual curve of the ratio. In this view, we can change the threshold by dragging the arrow next to the threshold meter. And also adjust our output or makeup gain in the same way. The amount of gain reduction is also displayed in its own meter. Now for the last view. It's literally just the transfer curve view without the transfer curve. Now we know exactly how this compressor works. Let's try compress a drum loop and get it sounding nice and punchy. Let's start with a little bit of EQ. Now we can work on the compression. It's actually not sounding too bad, but some of the drum parts are just a little too loud in some areas, and it could use a little more punch and groove. So let's have a look at the activity view. Yeah, the snare is just a little loud and the cymbals lack some groove and vibe. We'll dial in the punch using the attack, and then how heavy and groovy we want it using the release. So let's start out by bringing our threshold down a little bit. Actually, why don't we use our threshold trick that I was talking about earlier and bring it all the way down. Now we're only hearing what the attack is doing, basically. Hear those transients? I think maybe about there sounds alright. So let's bring it back up to a realistic level. You won't need the threshold trick once you get a good ear for compression, but it definitely helps when you're starting out. Now we can work on the release. Yeah, there's definitely a sweet spot with this. Probably in between about 200 to 400 milliseconds. Any lower than about 100 is getting a bit too aggressive. And anything above about 400 is starting to sound a bit mushy. Yeah, I really like it around about there actually. Now let's give a listen to what linear mode as opposed to logarithmic sounds like. Yeah, logarithmic definitely sounds just a little bit smoother. Now we can bring up our output to make up some of the gain reduction. So on average it looks like we're doing around about maybe 6 dB of gain reduction, so let's start there. See what it sounds like bypassed, make sure we're getting the same, roughly the same volume. Maybe set it a little bit louder now. Bring it down to 5. That's about right there, I think. Notice how that after each loud kick and each snare hit, it's kind of bringing the cymbals down as well. It's giving that sort of more of a groovy vibe. Now we've got the basic settings dialed in, we can start tweaking our ratio to get the exact amount of compression we're after. I think that's basically limiting at that point, so I think it's just a bit too much. Bring it back down. Let's tweak the threshold as well. Yeah, I definitely think about where we had it is fine anyway. So this is sounding nice and punchy now. Hopefully this video helped you understand compression. If it's still a little confusing, don't worry. Just open your door and start having a play around with what you did understand. Then come back to this video, and on the second watch, the stuff you didn't quite get will be easier for your brain to digest. In part 2, I'm going to go over some more common and advanced techniques with compression, such as sidechaining, multiband, upwards and parallel compression, and also gates and limiters. Perhaps some of these topics will also need to be divided into a third video, but we'll see. If you like the video, please consider subscribing, and also feel free to join my Discord, where you can personally ask me questions and suggest video topics. All links are listed in the description. Until next time, cheers.